Hello, Waterford Wesleyan Church Online. My name is Pastor Matt. I'm the assistant pastor here at Waterford Wesleyan Church, and we just have two quick announcements for you before we get into Pastor Paul's message today. And the first is this. We have what is called a text to pray line open all the time. And what it is what you can do is you text the word pray, P-R-A-Y, to 518-223-8662. So maybe you're going through something not so great, or maybe God is working in your life and you are seeing it, and we want to be able to pray with you and for you through both of those situations. So what you can do is you text the word pray to 518-223-8662. You type in either your prayer or your praise, and those messages go directly to Pastor Paul and I, kept completely confidential. And what this is essentially doing is we are praying alongside you, and it's just a great way to be able to get the body of God behind you. And again, those are confidential to Pastor Paul and I. Nobody else see them unless you want that to be the case. So pray to 518-223-8662 for our text to pray line. Second announcement is this. Maybe you've been watching our videos ever since we started, right when COVID hit. And maybe you want to be able to give back to the community here in Waterford. You can do that. All you got to do is you got to go to waterfordwc.com, click on the Tithes and Offerings button at the top of the page, and you can give a one-time or maybe reoccurring donation to our ministry here in Waterford. So again, that's Waterford WC, Tithes and Offerings, and you can set up an account there, whether a one-time gift or maybe it's a reoccurring gift, whatever you want. So with all of that out of the way, here's Pastor Paul.
Last Monday morning, I had a dentist appointment at 8 a.m. Now, normally that's not a big deal. You just show up, you get it out of the way, and away you go. And the other side note to that is I really love going to the dentist, but that's a whole other topic for another day, of course. So here I am. It's 8 a.m. in the morning. It's usually not a problem, but this particular Monday it was. You see, the week prior to that was really busy. The weekend was even busier, and then we capped that off with a big community outreach here at church we often call Fall Festival. And so come Monday morning, I was dragging, and I got to the dentist, and I approached the desk where you register, and the girl there, who was wide awake and bubbly, said to me with way more energy than I was prepared for, "How are you doing this morning?" And I just said to her, "I'm present." And that was the best I was going to do. She laughed kind of awkwardly, like, okay, this guy's weird, and hoping I was going to say something else, but I just stood there staring into space. And she said, okay, you can go have a seat. And so I simply shuffled off to the waiting room, plopped down, and waited for my name to be called. So how was I doing? I was present. And I was, honestly, that's what I was doing, being honest with her. That's all it was. You see, when I'm asked how I'm doing, I choose now to be honest. Not even so much so with the person, but with myself. Because how many times have you had this interaction with someone? They say, "Hey, how are you doing?" You say, "Good, and you?" And nobody means any of it. Not as a judgment. It just becomes a polite greeting. That, "Hey, I'm good. How are you?" "I'm good, and you?" And nobody means any of that. Because how many times have you been miserable and you told somebody you're good? So I've decided to use those opportunities as a way to do a quick self-check. How am I? And so I'm honest with the person, but more importantly, I'm honest with myself. Because sometimes they'll ask me how I'm doing, and I'll say, "I'm okay." Other times they'll ask me how I'm doing, and I'll say, "I'm fantastic." And then, of course, I have a few cornier greetings also, like if you ask me how I'm doing, I'll say I'm dandy like candy. Or if you ask me how I'm doing, I'll tell you if I was any better, I'd be cloned. But the reason I do that isn't so much for the person, it's really for me. It's about checking my self-talk. What am I telling myself day in, day out? And I use those opportunities, meeting somebody, talking to somebody, and evaluate, what is my self-talk? What am I telling myself over and over again? Because I have a tendency to drift towards, negativity. I use those daily moments as like a self-talk check. What am I telling myself? So now I've come to the place where if a clerk or a waitress or the bank teller at the end of our transaction says, "And you have a great day," and I said, "Well, that's my intent." Or "That's my plan." And they laugh, but I'll tell you what, it's not about being, again, funny or cute. It's about keeping in front of me, my plan is to have a good day. My intent is to have things move in a positive direction. And I do control a lot of that, how I move forward. Because I have many times in my life planned out miserable days. And you probably have as well. Now, the problem with that is I'm not doing this self-talk check for some self-improvement plan. The problem with that, the reason I do that is because I need to make sure it doesn't go sour. And in my life, and my attitude, and my heart can go sour. It can go sour pretty fast and pretty ugly. And so these self-check moments of what I'm telling myself, the way I'm thinking, the way I'm looking at my future, keeps me in the right perspective. And the reason that's so important is it doesn't just affect me. It doesn't just affect the people around me. Ultimately, my attitude will eventually bleed over into how I see God and how I see my relationship with him and where I stand with him. Because I've discovered this, when I've grumbled about life over and over again, and I've complained about it, and I've been miserable, and I've chosen to be negative about everything, eventually that spills over into how I see God. And it's been my issue all along. All the time, my issue. And I realize this, I'm not alone. Now, maybe you're sitting there thinking, well, that guy's got some problems. And maybe I do. Maybe you figured this all out. But I know I'm not alone because I've seen this happen in the life of the Israelites over and over and over again, where God is there, he's providing, he's blessing them, and they complain and they grumble again and again and again. So we're going to take a quick look at that today. It's the season where the Israelites have been freed from Egyptian slavery. They're wandering in the desert for 40 years. And the one particular season we're going to look at is where God provided for them once again in a miraculous way. You see, even through that whole season where there's a pattern where the Israelites grumble against God and then God provides. They grumble against God and God provides. And it keeps happening and going on and on and on again. He releases them from Egyptian slavery. He parts the Red Sea. He provides water out of a rock. He provides manna, bread from heaven. I mean, it's just over and over again. And then when they complain about the manna, he sends them quail. I mean, it's just this pattern that they have. But as they get towards the end of their 40 years, something happens and their complaining and their negativity kind of ramps up a bit. And this is where we're going to pick up our scripture today. We're going to look at one particular section where their grumbling got, well, a lot worse. And their grumbling against God's sessions this one is especially offensive to God. Now, before we read this portion of Scripture, I want to tell you one more thing about this time frame. God had just given them victory over the Canaanites. A battle they had with the Canaanites just gave them victory over it. And this is how they respond to another blessing of God in their life. Numbers chapter 21, we'll begin reading at verse 4. They traveled from Mount Hor along the route to the Red Sea to go around Edom. But the people grew impatient on the way. They spoke against God and against Moses and said, "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt? To die in the wilderness? There is no bread, there is no water, and we detest this miserable food." Then the Lord sent venomous snakes among them, and they bit the people, and many Israelites died. The people came to Moses, and they said, "We sinned when we spoke against the Lord and against you. Pray that the Lord will take these snakes away from us." So Moses prayed for the people. The Lord said to Moses, "Make a snake and put it up on a pole. Anyone who is bitten can look at it and live." So Moses made a bronze snake and put it up on a pole. Then anyone who was bitten by a snake and looked at the bronze snake, they lived. I'm sure you heard the complaining there. They had to travel around Edom, and they grew impatient, like, oh, this is terrible. But what you need to know about that, why this may have been like the final straw for many of them, was this. The Edomites were really their relatives. So what you need to know is the Edomites are descendants of Esau. Esau's brother is Jacob, who later is named Israel. So you see that Esau and Israel, they're brothers, and the Israelites and the Edomites are ultimately relatives. And the Edomites say to the Israelites, when they're trying to make their way to the promised land, they're like, yeah, no, you can't pass through our land. So the response from the Israelites sounds like this in verse 4. When they traveled from Mount Hor along the route to the Red Sea to go around Edom, the people grew impatient on the way. So here they are. Now they have to go farther. Oh, what a tragedy. And you can hear it start like this. Oh, the stupid Edomites. And some family, huh? I mean, the grumbling starts there, but it certainly doesn't end. Now they have to go farther. God didn't just give them a miraculous way through that, so that wasn't good enough for them. But he's continuing to provide for them along the way, even though it's taking longer and they have grown impatient. Then if you look at verse 5, you see where it really takes off. They spoke against God and against Moses and said, "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There's no bread, there's no water, and we detest this miserable food." Hold on a second. They detest this miserable food. God has been providing bread from heaven over and over again, and yet they detest it. And the grumbling grew worse. Not only do they detest God's provision, which we'll get back to in a minute, the grumbling kind of takes on a whole new level here. It's not just complaining to Moses anymore, complaining about Moses. Now they're complaining about Moses and God. This is something new, because in the past, the Israelites only complained against Moses. Now they're complaining against Moses and against God. You see, what's happening is that kind of attitude, that kind of grumbling, it becomes contagious and it spreads. You see, at this particular stage in the season in the history of the Israelites, that first generation that came out of Egypt, they're starting to die off. Miriam, Moses' sister, dies. Aaron, Moses' brother, dies. And so they're starting to die off. And the younger generation now is complaining, and they're taking that complaining a little bit higher of a level. They're complaining not against Moses, but Moses and God. You see, that kind of attitude, that kind of perspective most certainly gets rather dangerous for sure. And when you're there, you're miserable. And so is everyone else. But now worse is they're complaining against Moses and again complaining against God. And I want to tell you something. That is a bad place to be when everything is wrong. And no matter what God does, it's like, well, that's not good enough. Charles Spurgeon, the great preacher from many, many years ago, said it this way about those people in that particular time. He said, to men in this state, nothing is right. Nothing can be right. You know people like that. You have them at work. You see them coming when you're at work at the water cooler and off to your desk you go because I don't want to be around that. I don't want to hear it. For them, nothing is right. Nothing can be right. They just kind of suck the life out of you. Or you find that it's contagious. You start thinking the same way or feeling the same way. Or you're at a party and people show up and you're like, that person's going to suck the life out of the room and you find a way to get out of it. But I do have to tell you this. Even worse than seeing that person coming, you know what's worse than that? When I'm that person. Because I've been that person. And sometimes I still can slip into being that person. When all I see is what God isn't doing. Because they grew impatient, just like the Israelites, to have to go around Edom. Oh no, the tragedy. But then that's all you see. I miss then, not what God isn't doing, but what God is doing. And I just focus on what isn't happening. And grumbling about my situation and then grumbling against God. I've been there. The Israelites have been there. And my guess is you have too. I mean, yeah, the Israelites had to travel farther, sure. Things don't always go the way I want them to either. But God provided for them all the way through. Even though they did have to travel farther, he still continued to provide. Look, when nothing is right, nothing can be right. That's just the way we start to become. And we come to the place then where our miserable attitude is contagious. We complain about our life and we take it out further and we complain about God. And that's not a good place to be. We come to the place then where the bread from heaven is miserable. We detest it. We detest God's provision in our life. It's a really scary place to be, where God's provision for you is burdensome or contemptible. It was for the Israelites, and I have to admit, I have been there too. When God isn't doing what you want on your timeline, you complain against him. The Israelites did. I have as well. Even to the place where God is providing for me and I'm still upset about that. Now, I might not complain not having manna from heaven, but I have done other things. I remember years ago when I was in the working world before I went into ministry, I had a job during a bad economic time and a lot of my friends didn't. God provided that for me and guess what I did? I complained about my job. That's God's provision and I'm detesting it. Look, I have a wonderful family and many friends that are valuable to me. And guess what? I've complained about them, but God has provided those people in my life. I know forgiveness in Jesus and others don't. And I complain, oh, the road is narrow. I have hope in Christ and others don't. And I'm like, oh, I have to read the Bible. I have peace in Jesus and others don't. And I'm like, oh, church is early. You get the idea. You have hope, peace, joy, confidence, salvation in Jesus, and you find yourself complaining about those things. The Israelites did it. I've done it, and my guess is again, you have at some point too. So here's the point. What happens is you start looking for the worst in every situation. You're going to find it. And the real problem isn't that you become bitter and miserable. The real problem is you miss God's hand in your life over and over again. And eventually you will come to the place where you complain about God's blessing in your life. That's where the Israelites were, and I have been there too. And you're grumbling against God for what he's doing in your life. And when you're there, it's a pretty dangerous place to be because you know what? God will give you everything you want. He'll give you all that miserableness that you want. He'll go, here you go. Look at verse 6. Then the Lord sent venomous snakes among them, and they bit the people, and many Israelites died. That may sound a little bit extreme on the surface. I mean, God sent these snakes and bit people and they started dying. I mean, that sounds pretty intense to me. But ultimately, he just pulled back. He's like, okay, that's what you want. I'm in the way. You guys do it all on your own. See, many theologians believe that those snakes are carpet vipers. And if they're carpet vipers, they're native to the area. So all God did was just say, okay, that's what you want. It's all yours. And that's not a whole lot different than what the Apostle Paul tells the church in Rome, that when we resist God or we reject God, in Romans chapter 1, verse 24, Scripture says that God then gave them over to their sinful desires. In Romans chapter 1, verse 26 says God gave them over to their shameful lusts. In Romans chapter 1, verse 28, God gave them over to a depraved mind. In other words, God goes, okay, that's what you want. There you go. And here come the vipers. The Israelites began complaining. They were complaining to Moses. They were complaining about Moses, and then they ratcheted it up and they complained to Moses and about Moses. They complained to God and about God, about their situation, and against Moses and against God, and the vipers come. Look, here's the deal. You and I are no different. Or maybe you are, but I'm just telling you where I'm at. It starts small with a bit of negativity and it grows quickly into grumbling against God and what God isn't doing. Then you find yourself grumbling about what God is doing. And God's like, okay, there you go. You're on your own. So let me ask you this. Have you embraced negativity in your life? Or maybe the question is, where have you embraced negativity in your life? And you've allowed what God is doing, or you just complain about what God isn't doing all the time. Where have you complained about your life? Where has that been an offense to you that you're constantly like, oh, God isn't this or God isn't that? Where is that happening in your life? Where have you blamed God? Or where have you complained about God's provision in your life? Because if you continue to grumble, or even call God's blessing burdensome, or you view it as contemptible, God's going to allow you to have all the miserableness and the negativity that you want. He'll just go, okay, it's yours. You can have all the vipers that you want. So, let me ask you this question. How are you doing? No, and I mean, really, no. How are you doing? Because how you answer that will tell you the direction you're moving. If I ask you that question, and I don't expect you to say it out loud, but in your mind, if I ask you, how are you doing? Maybe your answer is, well, I'm scared, I'm hurt, I'm confused, I'm miserable, I'm angry, I'm filled with joy. I don't know what your answer is, but what you're telling yourself and your perspective of how you're actually doing does set the path, and you can already see it. You can become miserable, call what God's doing in your life, the fact that he's not doing it the way you want to, they call that miserable and negative and awful, and it spills over to other people. And then not only that, when he does bless you, you call that contemptible. Into the place where God says, okay, you're on your own. How are you viewing your trials? How are you viewing your blessings? How are you seeing God? You see, here's the truth. God will provide. And we're going to talk about this in our next video of how even in the resistance and the negativity and all the things that they threw against God, the Israelites did, he still showed up for them when they said, God, we're sorry. And so how do you see God today? God will provide even when you grumbled against him, even when you complained against him, even when you complained against his blessing in your life. He will send you a solution for your vipers because he is faithful, he is good, and he is true. Today, choose to start looking at what do you tell yourself all the time? What is your attitude towards God? What is your attitude towards the way things are happening in your life that you don't like? What is your attitude towards God? And then once we come to grips with that and answer that question honestly, I'll challenge you as I challenge myself all the time. Begin to seek God and say, God, if there's a thing in my life that's an offense to you, I'm going to confess that and come clean. Because God will provide a way out that you don't have to get to the place where you've got nothing left but vipers. Trust him today. Follow Jesus today. Open your heart wide before him and let him show you the true attitude that you have and where your heart is with others and ultimately with God.